So Simple tutorial. Good morning students, welcome to SST So Simple tutorial. I hope you must have attended all the classes, topic wise classes of the Cold War era. Today I am going to do a one short revision of the Cold War era. So let us begin with the Second World War. The Second World War was fought between two blocs, the Allies and the Axis powers. The Allies included mainly Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States of America. The Axis powers included mainly Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy. It broke out in 1939 and came to an end in 1945. What was the result of this war? The Second World War resulted in the victory of the Allied powers. The Axis powers were defeated badly. How did the war end? The war ended with the surrender of Germany in May 1945 and the unconditional surrender of Japan in the month of August following the US dropping of atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My dear students, this war was fought not only in Europe but was spread out to regions outside Europe, including Southeast Asia, China, Burma, and parts of India's northeast. This was the most destructive of all the wars that were fought before. The death and destruction were enormous. At least 60 million people are believed to have been killed directly or indirectly as a result of this war. Millions more were injured. Besides the loss of human lives, this war is also remembered for the economic loss and destruction. Let us now try to understand the consequences of war. Dear students, after the war, a new balance of power was established. The leadership of the world slipped from the hands of England and came into the hands of the US and the USSR. The USA and the USSR emerged as the two superpowers. This is in brief about the Second World War that you are in fact aware of. Let us now move further. Okay. Students, the end of the Second World War was also the beginning of the Cold War. America and the Soviet Union, who were friends, who were fighting from the same side during the war, became rivals in political sphere, and a competition arose between them to assume the leadership of the world. So what is this Cold War? Let us see. The Cold War, my dear students, was a state of conflict, tensions, and a series of confrontations between the United States and the Soviet Union backed by their allies. But it was not a state of armed struggle. It was a state in which the rivals, while maintaining their peacetime diplomatic relations, continued their hostility. They used all means other than war to weaken each other. It was a kind of verbal war, fought through newspapers, radios, and other propaganda methods. So Cold War was not a war. It was an atmosphere of war, even more terrible than a hot war. I hope this is understood by you all. Now what you need to understand is that whether the Cold was simply a matter of power rivalry of military alliances and of the balance of power. No, it was not so. It was also accompanied by the ideological differences between the two nations as well. America is a capitalist, liberal democratic country, whereas Russia is a communist, one-party state. Hence, naturally, there can never be harmony between the two as the fundamental principles of these countries are just contrary to each other. Some historians view that the Cold War began with the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. After the success of Bolshevik Revolution, Russia tried to propagate the ideology of the revolution to the rest of the world. The Allied powers did not like this idea at all. They wanted that the Soviet government of Bolsheviks should be abolished by all means. That is why, if you remember, when civil war broke out post-Bolshevik revolution, that is from 1918 to 1922, European powers had supported the anti-revolutionary forces. Understood? Okay. Before the bomb was dropped in Japan, dear students, America had maintained this secret from Stalin. Russia had never expected that the US would hide the secret of atom bomb from her. This also alarmed Russia about her own security. However, soon Soviet Union also conducted her nuclear tests in 1949. So now both these superpowers were holding nuclear weapons. They had the capacity to destroy each other. But at the same time, both of them were also aware of the magnitude of destruction that these weapons would cause. They understood well the price that they would have to pay in case of nuclear attack on each other. Thus, none of the sides wanted to take the risk. Hence, in such a situation, a full fledged war was unlikely to happen. My dear students, this negative motivation is called the logic of deterrence. The word deterrence has come from the word deter. To deter means to discourage or prevent from doing something. So, in the logic of deterrence, one actor prevents another from taking some action by raising fear in the latter, the consequences that will ensure. So, deterrence is basically a strategy for combining two competing goals: one, countering the enemy, and second, avoiding war. This concept is very simple. An enemy will not strike if it knows that the defender can defeat the attack or can inflict unacceptable damage in retaliation. This is what was happening here. Both the US and the USSR had the capacity to retaliate against the nuclear attack and cause destruction to each other. But none of them wanted to initiate the war. Thus, the Cold War, in spite of being an intense form of military rivalry between great powers, remained cold and did not turn hot. It never got converted into a full fledged war. The logic of deterrence thus could not stop the rivalry, but it prevented a full fledged war. Thank God, good sense prevailed in the two superpowers. They acted rationally and responsibly as they understood the risk of another world war. This is how the Cold War managed to ensure human survival and avoided destruction. After having a general idea of the Cold War, let us discuss the Cuban Missile Crisis. My dear students, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and this was the moment when both these superpowers came closest to nuclear conflict. So, what happened in Cuba? What led to this crisis? On 1st of January 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew the government of Batista and took over the control of Cuba. Batista was the military dictator of Cuba. Thereafter, Castro ruled Cuba from 1959 to 2008. When Castro took over Cuba, he ordered that American owned businesses would be taken over. That means they would be nationalized. America was not happy with this decision. Thereafter, in 1960, Cuba aligned with the Soviet Union in a trade deal. This further angered the US. The US officially cut all diplomatic ties with Cuba in January 1961. Thereafter, the US government trained some 1500 Cuban exiles and tried to overthrow the communist regime of Castro through them. But Castro troops defeated the Cuban exile army. This incident is called Bay of Pigs invasion. So this operation, backed by the US, failed. But Castro feared a new attack from the USA. By now, Cuba was an ally of the Soviet Union and received both diplomatic and financial aid from it. So he looked toward the USSR, who were willing to provide assistance. In April 1961, the leaders of the USSR were worried that the USA would invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. So Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of Soviet Union, decided to convert Cuba into a Russian base to deter any further attempt of invasion. In 1962, the Soviet Union began secretly placing ballistic missiles in Cuba that were capable of firing nuclear weapons into American cities. So it was a direct security threat to the US. The installation of these weapons in Cuba had put USA for the first time in a danger zone. The US was now under a close range of fire by the USSR weapons. You can see this on the map. This had put millions of Americans, besides a number of defense bases and cities, in the range of weapons that could hit them within a few minutes if launched from Cuba. Americans were not aware of these developments until a spy plane of the US discovered this on the 14th of October 1962. Kennedy discussed with his advisors about the options they had and what could be done. They could invade Cuba, or they could go for airstrikes against the missile bases, or they could blockade Cuba to stop more deliveries from the USSR. But in any case, two things were clear. One, they were reluctant to do anything that might lead to full-scale nuclear war between the two countries. And two, they were determined to get Soviet Union to remove the missiles and nuclear weapons from Cuba. Finally, the US decided to blockade Cuba. Kennedy ordered American warships to intercept any Soviet ships heading to Cuba as a way of warning the USSR of its seriousness. Students, this was a point that was the peak of tension. American and Soviet naval vessels came into close proximity. A nuclear war seemed imminent. This is what made the whole world nervous. The world held its breath for nearly 2 weeks in October 1962. But to the world's great relief, both sides acted sensibly and decided to avoid war. Soviet ships turned around before reaching the blockade. Thanks to the timely and positive negotiation between Kennedy and Khrushchev. The US promised not to invade Cuba and Khrushchev promised to withdraw the missiles. So students, you will agree that the Cuban Missile Crisis was rightly a high time of the Cold War. Let us now discuss the emergence of two power blocs. Dear students, after the World War, the US and the USSR emerged as two superpowers. These powers then intended to expand their sphere of influence in different parts of the world. So they started to make alliances by trying to bring more and more countries into their fold. In this alliance system, a state was supposed to remain tied to a superpower to limit the influence of the other superpower and its allies. But here, one question may arise in your mind. Why should a country join an alliance? And also, why should a superpower need an ally? Superpowers were after all superpowers. They had nuclear weapons, they had regular armies. They were so powerful that the combined power of most of the smaller states in Asia and Africa and even in Europe was no match to those of the superpowers. Dear students, the reason is simple. The smaller states had their own interests and the superpower also benefited from them. Thus, the alliance was basically a symbiotic kind of relationship. Both of them benefited from each other. On becoming a part of alliance, smaller states got many things. What are they? They got the promise of protection, they got weapons, and also economic aid against their local neighbors with whom they had rivalries. Let us now see what the superpowers got in return. First of all, they got access to the vital resources such as oil and minerals. The smaller countries like those located in the Middle East were a source of vital resources such as oil, minerals, raw materials, etc., which could be beneficial for the superpowers to wage a war. The second is territory. The superpowers got territory where they can station their military equipment, weapons and troops to launch attack on the enemy. In the Cuban case, we have seen that the Soviet Union used the territory of Cuba to install its weapon against the US. The next important thing is location. The superpowers got access to locations wherefrom they could secretly keep an eye on the movement of the enemy. That means wherefrom they could spy on each other. Then comes economic support. The small states could also be an economic support. That is, at times of need, the small allies could collectively help pay for military expenses. The smaller states were also important for ideological reasons. Smaller countries becoming an ally also meant that the superpowers were winning the war of ideas as well. Both the blocs wanted to prove that their ideology was more popular and useful for the nations. Therefore, they made efforts to increase the number in their respective blocs. If countries joined the American bloc, that meant the ideology of liberal democracy and capitalism was better and so attractive. The same was true for the other bloc also. I hope you understood what made the smaller states join the alliances and how it was advantageous for the superpowers. Let us now see how alliances were being formed. The division first started in Europe. Most countries of Western Europe went with the US side, and those of Eastern Europe joined the Soviet camp. That is why the American camp was also called the Western Alliance and the Soviet camp the Eastern Alliances. Later on in 1949, the Western Alliance took shape of an organization called NATO, that is, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was basically a political and military alliance. This treaty has a preamble and 15 articles. What is noteworthy is Article 5 of the treaty. It says that parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against all of them. In such a case, each member state was obliged to help the other. Thus, through NATO, the security of North America and Europe are permanently tied together. There are 30 member countries of NATO today. What did the Eastern Alliance do then? The countries of Eastern Alliance signed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Warsaw is in Poland. It is the capital city of Poland. In this pact, mutual defense treaty was signed by the representatives of Russia, Bulgaria, Albania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland and Romania. This Warsaw Pact was a carbon copy of the NATO and its main function was to counter NATO forces in Europe. Let us see some other alliances. Like the NATO, the United States built an alliance system in Southeast Asia in 1954 called SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It was formed with France, Great Britain, New Zealand, Philippines, Thailand and Pakistan. The objective was again the same, to stop further spread of communist influence in Southeast Asia. Another similar alliance that was formed in the Middle East by the US was CENTO, Central Treaty Organization. The objective was to counter the threat of Soviet expansion in the Middle East oil producing areas. It included Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, UK and of course the US. Now, to counter this move, Soviet Union and the Communist China started to develop close relations with regional countries like North Vietnam, North Korea and Iraq. So students, NATO was formed to contain the spread of communism and Warsaw Pact led by Soviet Union was formed to counter the NATO forces. Now students, when the Cold War was dividing the world into two alliances, many countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America became free. They did not want to join any of the alliances. So they launched a new movement called Non-Aligned Movement. These countries were called Third World countries. Let us now discuss the arenas of the Cold War. When we say arenas of the Cold War, we mean the areas which faced crisis, where wars were fought, or there was a possibility of war between the two alliances. We have very recently read about Cuban Missile Crisis. So Cuba was one arena of Cold War. Similarly, during the Cold War, crises occurred in other parts of the world also. Sometimes situations went beyond threats and resulted in armed conflicts. But in none of the cases, conflicts led to another world war. In some of these arenas, like Korea and Berlin, the two superpowers came into direct confrontations. In some areas, Like Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, many lives were also lost. But once again, none of them turned into a world war or a nuclear war. So, Korea, Berlin, Vietnam, Congo, Afghanistan, Cuba, all these were arenas of Cold War. In all these examples, my dear students, what you find is that both the rival blocs were helping the groups supporting their respective ideologies. And in all such wars, neither of the parties involved was willing to back down. In some cases, huge military buildups were reported. Sometimes diplomatic talks between the superpowers failed, and this contributed to misunderstandings. Fortunately, someone or the other mediated and tried to defuse the situation. For example, Jawaharlal Nehru, one of the most important leaders of non-aligned movement, played a crucial role in mediating between the two Koreas. We will discuss non-aligned movement sometime later. Similarly, in the Congo crisis, the UN Secretary General played a key mediatory role. But by and large, the superpowers realized that there was no winner in case of a nuclear war. So they felt that war must be avoided by all means. And it was this realization that made them exercise restraint and behave more responsibly. But at the same time, the two sides also understood that war might occur in spite of restraints. And if that happens, their capacity should not be proved less than the capacity of the other. There was always a feeling of suspicion and mutual distrust between them. And as a result of this suspicion that the other might become more powerful, both these powers began to arm themselves. Both of them thought that increasing their stocks of weapons will threaten the other. Hence, stockpiling of arms was considered necessary to deter the other. This way, they also intended to demonstrate the other bloc that they were better prepared and had better capacity to damage the other. So, they put more emphasis on their military preparedness. But what happens, dear students? Military preparedness of one automatically leads to military buildup of the other. Thus, it led to unending arms race between them. Both of them spent large sums of money on arms and amassed deadly weapons. But at the same time, there were other concerns as well, like what if a nuclear accident takes place? Like what would happen if someone fired off a nuclear weapon by mistake? Or if a soldier mischievously shot off a weapon deliberately to start a war? One cannot rule out these possibilities. Then how would the leaders of that country know that it was an accident and not an act of sabotage by the enemy? See, these are genuine concerns. So both the superpowers thought it prudent to move into the direction of disarmament and arms control. They collaborated in limiting certain kinds of nuclear and non-nuclear weapons. Working in this direction, the two sides signed three significant agreements. They were the Limited Test Ban Treaty, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Let us know about them. The first such treaty is LTBT, that is Limited Test Ban Treaty. This treaty banned nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in the outer space, and underwater. The second treaty is NPT, Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was signed in 1968. What does this treaty say? This treaty allows only the nuclear weapon state to have nuclear weapon and stops others from acquiring this. So, who will be called a nuclear weapon state now? For the purposes of the NPT, a nuclear weapon state is one which manufactured and exploded a nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device prior to January 1967. So, according to this treaty, there are only 5 nuclear weapon states, that is US, the USSR, Britain, France and China. It is for this reason India and few others are not acknowledged as nuclear weapon state. India, dear students, has not signed this treaty, citing it discriminatory. The next is SALT 1, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks 1. The first round of strategic arms limitation talks began in November 1969. The Soviet leader Brezhnev and US President Nixon signed the following in Moscow on 26 May 1972. First, Treaty on Limitations of Anti-Ballistic Missile System ABM and Interim Agreement on the Limitation of Strategic Offensive Arms. It entered into force on 3rd of October 1972. The next is SALT 2. Negotiations for the SALT 2 started in November 1972. The US President Jimmy Carter and Soviet leader Brezhnev signed this treaty on the limitation of strategic offensive arms in Vienna on 18th June 1979. The next is START Treaty. The START Treaty seemed to end the Cold War between the two superpowers. START 1, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 1. This treaty was a bilateral arms control between the US and the Soviet Union. It was signed in July 1991. START 2, that means Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 2. This was similar to START 1. It was signed in January 1993 between the presidents of Russia and the USA. This treaty stipulated that nuclear stockpiles would be reduced to two-thirds within 10 years, that means by January 2003. In January 1994, the United States and Russia agreed not to target their missiles at each other. Thereafter, the superpowers held several rounds of arms limitation talks and signed several more treaties to limit their arms. So this is in brief arms control treaties. Let us now discuss the timeline of the Cold War era. This timeline, students, will give you a complete picture of the Cold War from the beginning till the end. Okay, so let us get started. 1947, American President Harry Truman's doctrine about the containment of communism. President Truman, in his address to American Congress in March 1947, made this announcement. Actually, he was seeking approval for his plan to render military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey, which were involved in civil war. He stated that America should provide moral and financial support to countries whose political unity was endangered by communism. So this doctrine was first practical application of the policy of containment. This meant keeping Russia's power or the area of control within acceptable boundaries. 1947-52 Marshall Plan, US aid for the reconstruction of the Western Europe. Under Marshall Plan, America undertook the economic recovery program on a grand scale. This plan was formulated by US Secretary of State George C. Marshall in June 1947. American leaders had realized that economic aid would be more effective than military aid, as suggested in the Truman's doctrine, to secure Europe from the communists. So the main purpose of Marshall Plan was to fight out poverty and economic crisis so that Europe could be saved from communism. 1948-49 Berlin blockade by the Soviet Union and the airlift of supplies to the citizens of West Berlin by the US and its allies. Dear students, since her defeat in the Second World War till the unification in 1990, Germany had been a zone of Cold War. You know that Germany surrendered in May 1945. Thereafter, it was partitioned into 4 zones. You can identify them in the map. Each zone was placed under USA, Britain, France and the USSR. Later, the United States, Britain and France decided to merge their zones and created West Germany. USSR established a separate government in her zone which came to be known as East Germany. Thus, by 1949, two separate states of Germany came into being. Strange enough, the capital city Berlin was also split, even though it was on the side of East Germany. The way Germany was split, in the same way the city of Berlin was also split, and later on British, American and the French zones were united. In 1948, the Western powers introduced in 1948, the Western powers introduced many reforms to rebuild West German economy. As a result, the economic conditions in West Germany improved a lot. These economic reforms introduced by the Western powers were not acceptable to Russia. So they tried to block all communications between West Germany and West Berlin. Since all land routes were closed, America and Britain had to airlift goods, fuel, medicines, and other necessities to West Berlin for about a year. This is what we call Berlin blockade. This blockade was lifted in May 1959. With the blockade of Berlin by Russia, the Cold War reached its climax. But Soviet Union could not muster enough world support to shoot down any aircraft flying the Russian zone. Next, 1950-53, Korean War, division of Korea along the 38th parallel. Students, the Korean War was fought between North Korea and South Korea from 1950 to 1953. Let us briefly understand the background. Korea was annexed by Japan in 1910. Since then, it was held with Japan. The division of Korea students began with the defeat of Japan in the Second World War. As all of you know, Japan had to surrender after the atom bomb was dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Under the impact of Cold War, Korea was divided into North Korea and South Korea with the 38th parallel line as the dividing line. You can see the Korean peninsula in the map. In North Korea, a communist government supported by the Soviet Union was set up. In South Korea, an American-sponsored government was set up. The war began on 25th of June 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. This war was virtually a conflict between the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc. North Korea was supported by China and the Soviet Union, while South Korea was supported by the United States and allied countries. After the death of Stalin in 1953, the fighting ended with an armistice signed on 27th of July 1953. Armistice means an agreement made by opposing sides in a war to stop fighting for a certain time. So almost 70 years have passed since the end of the Korean War, but the two countries are still divided and technically at war. Due to Chinese involvement in the war, hostilities in Korea continued for a very long time. Next, 1954. Defeat of French by the Vietnamese. Division of Vietnam along the 17th parallel. I will cover this story in the succeeding discussion. Then, formation of Seattle. We have already read this. Next, 1954-75. American intervention in Vietnam. Let me briefly give the background. Indochina was a French colony. Indochina means Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. In 1941, the Japanese ousted the French from this region and held it until 1945. The Vietnamese, led by Ho Chi Minh, set up the Republic of Vietnam in 1945. The French tried to regain control over these territories since Japanese were defeated in the Second World War. Thus, a war ensued between France and Vietnam. The Viet Minh inflicted a severe blow to French forces at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Thereafter, at the Geneva Convention in 1954, Vietnam was partitioned with North Vietnam under a communist government and South Vietnam under an anti-communist puppet government of the USA. The people of both Vietnam wanted unification. The South Vietnamese government, which had US support, opposed unification because it did not want a communist government. So clashes arose between the people and the government of South Vietnam. This is the background, students, to understand the story further. So Vietnam War was fought mainly in South Vietnam between whom? US-backed government forces and Viet Cong guerrillas supported by North Vietnam and Soviet armaments. This war was, you can say, a proxy war of the Cold War era. But in the later years, the US got directly involved. This made Vietnam a center of Cold War. The war finally ended when the US troop left Vietnam in 1975. Next, 1955. Signing of the Baghdad Pact, later CENTO. This is also discussed before, so we will move next to 1961. US sponsored base of pigs invasion of Cuba. This part is already discussed in details in Cuban Missile Crisis. Then construction of the Berlin Wall. Berlin Wall was a wall built by the Russians in 1961 that surrounded West Berlin to prevent people getting in from East Berlin and adjacent areas of East Germany. Actually, the story goes like this. West Germany was making economic progress. Therefore, a large number of East Germans began to pour into West Germany. In the years between 1949 and 1961, about 2.5 million people, which included skilled workers, professionals and intellectuals, fled to West Germany. This annoyed Soviet Russia. So what Soviet Russia did? She constructed a wall which is called Berlin Wall to stop the movements of the East Germans. Understood? Next, 1962. Cuban Missile Crisis. You already know this story. Next, 1965. American intervention in the Dominican Republic. A civil war had erupted in the Dominican Republic in 1965. It started when civilian and military supporters of the overthrown democratically elected President Bush ousted the military installed President Donald Reed Cabral from office. The people of the Dominican Republic were trying to restore Juan Bosch to the presidency. The US had a concern about a communist takeover similar to what occurred in Cuban Revolution in 1959. The US forces were immediately deployed there in the name of protecting American lives, whereas the true reason for the invasion was the fear of communism. Next, 1968. Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia. What is this story? In 1968, Czechoslovakia under Dubček took some measures to ensure lot of freedom to the people. Dubček tried to bring in reforms like multi-party democracy and more freedom for the media. Russia feared that this would cause domino effect in East Europe and every country would start asking for more concessions if the present government was allowed to continue. Therefore, the Russian army intervened in 1969 and Dubček was replaced by a pro-Russian leader. Understood? Next, 1972. US President Richard Nixon's visit to China. Students, Nixon was the first ever president of US to visit China mainland while in office. This visit helped to break decades of hostility between the two. It was also seen as a master stroke, which shifted the Cold War balance of power by aligning with China against Russia. Understood? Next, 1979-89. Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. On 27 December 1979, the Afghan President Hafizullah Amin was overthrown in a coup by Babrak Karmel. There was an urgent request from the Afghan government for political and military help. Immediately, the Soviet troops rushed to Afghanistan against the anti-communist rebels and assumed complete military and political control of Kabul and large portions of the country. On the very next day, US President Carter criticized the Soviet move into Afghanistan and devised several measures to compel Moscow to withdraw. The United States then brought together all Mujahideen groups in Afghanistan and encouraged them to fight back Soviet troops. They were supporting the Mujahideens through Pakistan ISI. This is how you can see the relations between the two superpowers worsened again. The new Cold War, however, did not survive long. After Geneva Accord in 1987, Russia agreed to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan. Next, 1985. Gorbachev becomes the president of the USSR, begins the reform process. Students, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in USSR in 1985. He wanted to reform and liberalize the communist system. He wanted to strengthen the ties with the Western powers. You can read these developments as the weakening of Cold War. Next, 1989. Fall of the Berlin Wall, mass protests against government in East Europe. My dear students, the story of Berlin Wall is already covered a little while ago. So when Gorbachev came to power, the US-Soviet tension eased. There was a strong desire for the unification of Germany from all quarters. Thus, the Berlin Wall was pulled down in 1989. And most of the East European countries had popular uprisings against their communist governments. Next, 1990. Unification of Germany. The foreign ministers of America, Britain, France and Russia signed the Treaty of German Unification, and the merger of the two Germanys took place on 3rd of October 1990. This union, students, symbolized the unity of Eastern and Western powers. Next, 1991. Disintegration of the Soviet Union, end of the Cold War era. In December 1991, Soviet Union collapsed. Gorbachev resigned from his post. The disintegration of the Soviet Union gave birth to a new world order and the end of the Cold Era. This is in brief the chronology of the Cold War. Let us now go to Challenge to Bipolarity to discuss about NAM. This topic, students, views the non-aligned movement as a challenge to the dominance of the two superpowers. So far, we have seen how the Cold War was dividing the whole world into two rival alliances. It was in this situation India and many other countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America got freedom from their colonial powers. This is where non-alignment offered a third option to these newly independent countries to stay away out of the alliances by not joining any of them. This movement had its origin in Bandung, Indonesia, where President Sukarno hosted a conference of Asian and African countries in 1955. It was attended by 29 Asian and African countries. But the non-aligned movement as an organization was founded on the Brijuni Islands in Yugoslavia in 1956. In mid-1956, Tito, Nehruji and Nasser met here to assess the impact of Bandung Conference and discuss their vision for a non-aligned force. These ideas later took shape into the non-aligned movement. Indonesia's Sukarno and Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah strongly supported them. However, the first official non-aligned summit was held 5 years later in Belgrade in 1961 under the leadership of Tito, Nasser, Nehruji, Kwame Nkrumah and Sukarno. Belgrade was the capital of Yugoslavia till 2006. Students, Yugoslavia does not exist today. Belgrade is in Serbia today. Okay. The summit was attended by 25 member states and observers from 3 other countries. At this conference, a 27-point declaration was adopted in which they urged the superpowers to maintain peace and security in the world. They condemned colonialism in all forms. An appeal was made for total disarmament. Also, an invitation was extended to the Asian and African countries to be a part of the non-aligned movement. The membership of NAM thereafter kept growing. In the 17th summit that was held in Venezuela in 2016, there were 120 member states and 17 observer states. This was a clear indication that the countries were attracted towards the principles of non-alignment. Let us see some important objectives of NAM. The objectives of non-aligned movement has been laid off at the first summit itself. Some of the chief objectives were to uproot imperialism and colonialism, to promote international peace and security, complete disarmament, especially strong opposition to nuclear arms, to end racial discrimination and of course apartheid, effective cooperation with the United Nations in its peace efforts. Let us now see the meaning of non-alignment. As non-alignment grew into a popular international movement, countries of various different political systems and interests joined it. This made the movement less homogeneous and made it difficult to define in precise terms. In general, it meant not to support any group. In other words, staying away from any side. This staying away is often considered as isolationism or neutrality, which is not correct. Staying away should not be considered isolationism or neutrality. Students, non-alignment is not isolationism. Isolationism means keeping oneself aloof from the world affairs, non-involvement in the world affairs. For example, see the case of America. The policy that was followed by the US since the American War of Independence in 1787 till the beginning of the First World War is isolationism. America had isolated herself from the world affairs, whereas the non-aligned countries including India played an active role in mediating between the two rival alliances for the cause of peace and stability. Also, non-alignment is not neutrality. See, to know right and wrong and then not to side with anybody is neutrality. But to differentiate between the right and wrong and support the right is non-alignment. Neutral states simply stay out of war. They neither get involved in wars nor take any positions on the appropriateness or morality of a war. They are not even required to help end a war. Non-aligned states, including India, were actually involved in wars but for various reasons. They also worked to prevent war between other countries and tried to end wars that had broken out. Thus, non-alignment is an active and independent policy. A non-aligned country keeps herself away from narrow groupism, which is a danger to world peace. A non-aligned country does not become puppet of any powerful nation. According to this policy, friendly relations can be established with independent nations and active role can be played in international politics. I hope you have understood this concept. Let us now touch upon the last topic, India and the Cold War. Here, India means India not simply as any country, but as a member of NAM, as a leader of NAM during the Cold War. So here, India's action will be tested from the lens of NAM. India, dear students, played an important role during the Cold War. As a leader of the movement, India not only kept herself away from the power politics of the two blocs but also maintained equidistant from both the sides. This implies that India chose to be neutral, and this policy also enabled India to run an independent foreign policy. Secondly, India raised her voice against any newly decolonized countries that wished to become part of any power bloc. India wanted them to remain non aligned. So, India behaved in the same manner as was expected from the newly independent countries. But this act of India's policy should not be seen as negative or passive. Dear students, Nehruji had himself said that non alignment was not a policy of fleeing away. Fleeing away means running away. India was simply keeping away from power politics of the two blocs, but she was playing an active role by intervening in the world affairs to dilute the rivalries of the Cold War. India was not on the offensive side, India was on the peacemaking side. India demonstrated her non aligned position during the Korean War. India was actively involved in negotiating peace in the Korean Peninsula. In the Korean War, India was the chairman of the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission. India had also played the role of peacemaker in the war in Indochina. So, India's policy cannot be called a fleeing away sort of policy or passive or negative. Understood? India also mobilized other non aligned countries to further the cause of peace and stability, which was the goal of NAM countries. India tried to activate international organizations like UN and regional organizations to play a proactive role in de escalating tensions between the two superpowers. Non aligned was not, as some suggest, a noble international cause which had little to do with India's little interests. The position of non alignment actually served India's interests directly in at least two ways. First, non aligned allowed India to take international decisions and stances that served its interests rather than the interests of the superpowers and their allies. For a moment, just think what India would be doing if she had joined any of the alliances. India would just be serving the interest of that superpower. But India stayed politically neutral and took whatever benefits she could from both USSA and USSR. During the 1960s, USA had advanced loan to us and fulfilled our food grain needs. And when India decided to set up large steel plants, it was the Soviet Union which not only provided financial help but also gave us machines. Our Bhilai and Bokaro steel plants are the result of this help only. Understood? Okay. Secondly, India was often able to balance one superpower against the other. It did not invite threat from either bloc. Neither alliance system could take India for granted or bully it. If India felt ignored or unduly pressurized by one superpower, it could tilt towards the other. Okay, let us now discuss some criticisms. Dear student, India's policy of non alignment has also been criticized on some issues. We will consider here two only. First, India's non alignment was said to be unprincipled. In the name of pursuing its national interest, India, it is said, often refused to take a firm stand on crucial international issues. For example, in the case of Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, India is being accused that she neither condemned nor supported Soviet Union. So you decide whether this criticism is correct or incorrect. The next criticism that India faces is that India was inconsistent and took contradictory postures. India criticized others for joining alliances but signed the Treaty of Friendship with the USSR for 20 years. Was this treaty not a departure from India's non alignment policy? That is why signing this treaty was regarded by outside observers as virtually joining the Soviet camp. See, Pakistan had already joined SEATO and CENTO and was getting military and economic aid from the US. So during the Bangladesh crisis or say 1971 war, US was bound to help Pakistan against India. In such a situation, the government of India had no options. India needed diplomatic and military help, and hence this treaty. Let us now discuss a small topic, the relevance of NAM, and finish the chapter. Dear students, by now you know that the Cold War was the outcome of the emergence of two superpowers, the USA and the USSR, rival to each other. Thereafter, NAM came into existence. In 1991, USSR disintegrated and the Cold War came to an end. There is no rivalry now. The world is not divided now. The world has become unipolar. So what is the need of NAM after the end of bipolar world? The relevance of NAM is being questioned today. Students, here it will be incorrect to say that NAM is no more relevant. It is relevant even today. See, Cold War has come to an end, but not the problems. NAM was basically a group of developing countries, mostly former colonies. They had their problems. Those problems still exist today. They are still striving to overcome their poverty and backwardness. This demands for a more equitable order. Also, NAM, if you see as a concept, can never be irrelevant because principally it provides a strong base to the foreign policy of its members. It means that the poor countries need not become followers of any big power. They can pursue an independent foreign policy. Then, issues like disarmament, human rights, and environmental protection are as much relevant today as used to be earlier. Even some more new issues have come up, like terrorism, global warming, climate change, trafficking of drugs and weapons, etc. They need to be addressed. Although colonialism and racism Although colonialism and racism have ended, neo-colonialism continues to prevail. Countering this phenomenon demands greater cooperation among the non-aligned countries. Thus, NAM, which has served the useful purpose of protecting and preserving the interest of the Third World War countries well in the past, is also expected to serve their interest well in the future to come. The need of the hour is an effort by all member states to reaffirm their faith in the movement and build a strong bond among its member states. They can become a powerful force only when they come together and make this platform powerful. This is how they can strengthen the bargaining capacity of NAM. With this, we finish the quick revision of the lesson, the Cold War era. If you find this video useful, please subscribe to it and share with your friends. In the next class, we will meet with a new chapter, new topic. Till then, keep reading and have a nice time. Thank you.